The first snow of December dusted the streets of Ash Hollow, Nebraska, as if the heavens themselves were spreading a blanket of quiet magic over the town. Christmas lights flickered on the wooden porches of every home, and the faint smell of cinnamon wafted through the air from the bakery on Main Street. Ash Hollow was the kind of place where life moved at a steady pace, unbothered by the chaos of the outside world. And in the middle of it all stood the old evergreen park, nestled at the edge of the forest, a place where children built snowmen and families gathered for winter picnics. But this year, the joy of Christmas seemed muted in one corner of the park. There, under a frostbitten oak tree, stood a weathered box wrapped in crumpled, faded Christmas paper. It had once been adorned with a shiny red bow, now tarnished and sagging, forgotten like an afterthought. And next to that box was a dog, a wiry, mud-streaked mutt with a coat of patchy black and gray fur. His piercing yellow eyes stood out against his otherwise unremarkable appearance, and his demeanor was both alert and hauntingly melancholic. The people of Ash Hollow had grown accustomed to his presence over the last 4 years. They called him Wren. No one knew his real name, where he came from, or who had abandoned him, but they all knew the story, or rather, the mystery. Wren had appeared in the park 4 years ago, on Christmas Eve, and since then, he had refused to leave the side of that tattered box. It didn't matter if it rained, snowed, or if the summer heat blistered the pavement. Wren stayed. He was always there, guarding it like it held the meaning of his existence. Some townsfolk left food and water for him, but no one dared approach too closely. Wren wasn't aggressive, but his wary eyes and low growls made it clear that the box was sacred. Over the years, there were rumors. Some whispered that the box contained the remains of his owner, while others imagined it held some precious belonging that tied Wren to a past he couldn't let go of. A few even suggested it was just a dog's inexplicable obsession. Whatever the truth was, no one could deny the devotion in his eyes as he sat beside it, staring into the distance as though waiting for someone who never came. Among those who noticed Wren was 13-year-old Lila Carter. Lila had grown up in Ash Hollow, and she'd spent more time in Evergreen Park than anyone else. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the suffocating silence of her home after her mother's sudden death 3 years ago. Her father, David, had withdrawn into himself, burying his pain in endless shifts at the hardware store. Lila often felt like a ghost in her own house, unseen and unheard. But in the park with Wren, she felt something different. She couldn't explain it, but there was a kinship in the dog's unwavering loyalty, a connection between his heartbreak and hers. For months, she tried to approach him, inching closer each time she visited. She would sit on the frost-covered grass, talking to him in soft whispers, her voice trembling with secrets she couldn't share with anyone else. "You miss someone, don't you?" she'd say, her breath curling in the cold air. "I do too." Wren never responded, but he also never left while she was there. That was enough for Lila. As Christmas approached, Lila became more determined than ever to uncover the mystery of the box. The thought of Wren spending another Christmas in the freezing cold, waiting for someone who might never return, filled her chest with a sadness she couldn't shake. She decided that this year she would do something about it. Her father, however, didn't share her enthusiasm. "Lila, it's just a stray," he said one evening as they sat in their dimly lit living room. The twinkle of the Christmas tree lights reflected off the window, casting shadows on the walls. "You can't save every animal you see, but he's not just a stray, Dad," Lila protested, her voice tinged with frustration. "He's waiting for something, or someone." David sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. He had been a kind and patient man once, but grief had hollowed him out, leaving little room for hope or imagination. "It's been 4 years, Lila. Whatever he's waiting for isn't coming back." Lila stared at him, her eyes welling with tears. "And what if it's not about who's coming back? What if it's about what he needs now? What if he's just like us, waiting for something we can't fix?" Her voice cracked, and she hurried out of the room before he could respond. That night, Lila lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who had left the box? Why had Wren stayed? And, most of all, how could she help him? She didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't just walk away. Not from Wren. Not from the box. Not from the tiny spark of hope she saw in his eyes every time she visited. As snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the town in white, Wren remained at his post under the oak tree. The faint sound of Christmas carols drifted through the air, mixing with the crunch of boots on snow as families hurried home. But for Wren, time stood still. All he had was the box, the memories it held, and the unshakable hope that someday, someone would come to reclaim what he guarded so fiercely. And as Christmas drew closer, the weight of that hope began to shift. First in the heart of a girl who refused to give up, and then in ways no one in Ash Hollow could have foreseen. The days leading up to Christmas were cold and gray, as if even the skies over Ash Hollow carried the weight of the season's unanswered questions. Lila spent every afternoon at Evergreen Park, bundled in her thick blue coat and knitted scarf, sitting a few feet away from Wren. She brought him scraps of ham from her sandwiches and bowls of warm broth she made herself, sneaking them past her dad's watchful eye. It had become a ritual. Wren never moved to touch the box while she was there, but his unyielding gaze seemed softer in her presence, as if some small part of him understood her intentions. Yet, the more time Lila spent with Wren, the more she felt the mystery of the box clawing at her mind. Why did it matter so much to him? What could be inside that compelled a dog to give up everything? Comfort, shelter, safety, just to stay by its side. She would watch as Wren rested his chin on the edge of the box, the sadness in his eyes so profound it made her heart ache. She began to feel that solving the mystery wasn't just about helping Wren. It was about understanding something deeper, something unspoken that connected them both. Then came December 23rd, the day everything changed. That afternoon, Lila arrived at the park with her usual offerings of food and water, only to find a group of boys from her school circled around the oak tree. At first, she thought they were simply curious. Who wasn't curious about the dog and his box? But as she got closer, her stomach sank. "Stupid mutt won't even leave for a second," one boy sneered, poking at Wren with a stick. The dog growled low in his throat, his hackles raised as he stood protectively over the box. "Bet there's nothing even in it," another boy said. "Probably just trash." "Let's find out," the first boy said, stepping forward. "Stop it!" Lila's voice cut through the freezing air like a blade. She dropped her bag and ran toward them, her boots slipping on the icy ground. The boys turned, startled, but quickly regained their composure. "Relax, Lila. We're just trying to see what's so special about this stupid box." "Leave him alone," she shouted, placing herself between Wren and the boys. The dog stood rigid beside her, his growls growing louder. The boys exchanged glances, and one of them laughed nervously. "Whatever. You're as crazy as the dog." They shoved their hands into their coat pockets and walked away, muttering under their breath. When they were gone, Lila turned to Wren. He was still growling softly, his body tense, but his eyes met hers. For the first time, she reached out a trembling hand. "It's okay," she whispered. "They're gone now." To her astonishment, Wren didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned slightly into her touch, just for a moment, before retreating back to his post beside the box. Lila felt tears prick at her eyes, not just from relief but from the realization that, for the first time, Wren had trusted her, even if only a little. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. The boys' cruel laughter echoed in her mind, and the image of Wren growling over his box replayed itself over and over. What if they came back? What if they managed to take the box away or hurt Wren? The thought made her chest tighten with fear. She had to do something, anything, to protect him. The next morning, Christmas Eve, Lila woke up early and slipped out of the house while her father was still asleep. She didn't have a plan, only a determination that burned in her chest like a fire. When she reached the park, Wren was there, as always, his breath misting in the cold air. "Hey boy," she said softly, kneeling a few feet away from him. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Promise." She sat with him for hours, shivering in the cold but unwilling to leave him alone. She thought of her mom, of how she used to hum Christmas carols while decorating the tree, of how her absence had left a void in their home that nothing could fill. By late afternoon, the park was almost empty. Snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, blanketing the world in white. Lila reached into her bag and pulled out a scarf she had brought with her. A deep red wool scarf that had once belonged to her mother. She didn't know why she had brought it, only that it felt right. Carefully, she reached toward Ren and draped the scarf over his shoulders. "There," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Now you're ready for Christmas." Ren didn't move, but his eyes softened again, and Lila could have sworn there was something like gratitude in his gaze. She stayed with him until nightfall. The two of them huddled together under the oak tree as the town lights flickered on in the distance. But Lila wasn't the only one who had noticed the dog's vigil that day. Across town, an old man named Walter Green sat in his tiny kitchen, staring at the snow falling outside his window. Walter was a recluse, a man whose life had been marked by loss and regret. But as he sipped his coffee, he couldn't shake the memory of a dog he had once known, long ago. A dog with piercing yellow eyes and a coat of black and gray. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Ash Hollow had. But he had never dared to go to the park, to see if the dog everyone called Ren was truly who he thought it might be. The possibility was too painful, the guilt too overwhelming. That night, as the town celebrated Christmas Eve with laughter and warmth, Walter made a decision that would change everything. He pulled on his coat and hat, grabbed an old photograph from his desk, and headed out into the snow. The snow fell in dense, silencing sheets as Walter Green trudged through the streets of Ash Hollow. The old man's frame was bent and slow, and each step he took left a deeper imprint in the untouched snow than the last. In his gloved hand, he clutched the photograph, a small, weathered snapshot that trembled with each gust of wind. The image was simple. A little boy in a wool coat, crouched beside a dog. The dog's piercing yellow eyes seemed to glow even through the faded ink. Walter's heart clenched every time he looked at it. That photo was over a decade old, and the dog in it had once been his whole world. Could it really be him? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As Walter made his way toward Evergreen Park, memories clawed at the edges of his mind, unbidden and merciless. He remembered a Christmas morning 12 years ago, when his grandson Evan had unwrapped the greatest gift of his young life. A puppy they had named Rex. Rex had been a mutt, a scrappy mix of breeds that didn't matter because to Evan, Rex was perfect. The boy and the dog had been inseparable, chasing fireflies in the summer, sledding through the snow in winter. Walter had been a frequent companion on their adventures, delighting in the simple joy of their bond. But that joy had come to a tragic halt one icy winter night. Evan's parents, Walter's daughter and son-in-law, had been killed in a car accident while driving home from a Christmas party. The boy had been spared only because he had stayed home with Walter and Rex, begging not to miss his favorite Christmas movie. Walter had tried to raise Evan on his own after the accident, but grief weighed too heavily on both of them. Evan became withdrawn, and Walter, crushed by the guilt of his own failings, turned to alcohol to numb the pain. One bitter evening, after an argument that left them both in tears, Evan had stormed out of the house with Rex at his side. He was only 12 years old. That was the last time Walter had seen either of them. Rex had been spotted in the weeks following, wandering the woods alone, but Evan had disappeared without a trace. It was as though the boy had been swallowed by the winter night. Walter had spent years searching, grappling with the unanswered questions, until he finally resigned himself to the belief that Evan was gone. As for Rex, he assumed the dog had succumbed to the wilderness, too loyal to stray too far from the boy he loved. But now the stories of the dog in Evergreen Park had reopened old wounds. Could it truly be Rex, waiting all these years for someone who would never come back? Walter wasn't sure he could bear the answer, but the thought of doing nothing felt worse. His breathing quickened as he approached the park's entrance, the snow muffling his unsteady footsteps. Lila was still at the oak tree when she heard the crunch of boots on the snow behind her. She turned quickly, startled to see an old man walking toward her. His face was worn, his eyes shadowed by the weight of years, but there was something gentle about him that kept her from immediately feeling afraid. "Hello," the man said, his voice low and raspy. His breath curled in the freezing air. I heard about the dog." Lila stood, brushing snow from her coat. Ren remained seated by the box, his yellow eyes locked on the stranger. "You mean Ren?" she asked cautiously. Walter nodded, his gaze flickering toward the dog and then back to her. "That's what people call him, huh? Ren?" He hesitated, then added, "He looks just like a dog I used to know." Lila tilted her head. "You know him?" Walter hesitated, the photograph in his hand growing damp from his sweating palm. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but if it's who I think it is." "He's been waiting for a very long time." Lila frowned. "Waiting for what?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved closer to the oak tree, his steps slow and deliberate. Ren growled softly, his body taut, but he didn't retreat. Walter crouched down, holding out the photograph. "Rex," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Is that you, boy?" The name hit the air like a thunderclap. Lila's eyes widened, her heart racing as she watched the dog's reaction. "Ren?" "No," Rex stiffened, his ears twitching at the sound of the name. His yellow eyes darted between the man and the photograph, a flicker of recognition passing through them like a fleeting shadow. Then, slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward. Walter's breath hitched as the dog approached him. He knelt in the snow, his hands trembling as he reached out. "I'm so sorry, boy," he whispered, tears spilling down his weathered cheeks. "I'm so sorry I let you down." Rex sniffed the photograph, then the man's outstretched hands. For a moment, it seemed as though he might turn away, but then he pressed his nose against Walter's palm, a low, mournful whine escaping his throat. It was a sound that spoke of years of longing, of heartbreak, of hope that had never truly died. Lila watched in stunned silence as the man and the dog connected, their shared pain hanging heavy in the air. But the moment was cut short by a single, jarring realization: the box. Rex turned abruptly and stood over the tattered package, his body language urgent, his tail wagging slightly for the first time in years. He pawed at it, looking back at Walter and Lila as if to say, "This is what I've been waiting for. This is what you need to see." Walter exchanged a glance with Lila, his expression unreadable. "Do you know what's in there?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No, but I think it's time we find out." With trembling hands, Lila knelt by the box, her heart pounding. She glanced at Rex, who gave a soft bark of encouragement, and then carefully peeled back the damp, torn wrapping paper. Inside was an old, rusted tin box, its lid sealed tight with duct tape. Lila pried it open, her fingers stiff with cold, and gasped when she saw the contents. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of Evan and Rex. There was a folded letter, worn and yellowed, addressed to Walter. With shaking hands, he picked it up and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Dear Grandpa," it read, "I'm sorry I left. I didn't mean to hurt you, but I thought maybe I was hurting you by staying. Rex is the only one who understands. If you find this someday, please don't be mad at him for staying behind. He's waiting for you, just like I am." The letter was dated Christmas Eve, 12 years ago. Walter's sobs broke the silence, his breath hitching as he clutched the letter to his chest. Rex whined softly, nudging his shoulder with his nose. He thought I didn't want him anymore," Walter choked out. "All this time, he was waiting." Lila wiped tears from her own eyes, her heart breaking for both the man and the dog. But as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the park in quiet stillness, she realized this wasn't just a story of loss. It was a story of loyalty, of forgiveness, and of love that endured even when everything else had fallen away. The snowfall was heavier now, blanketing Evergreen Park in pristine white, but neither Walter nor Lila felt the cold. The letter trembled in Walter's hands as he read it again, his eyes scanning over every curve of Evan's handwriting, committing each word to memory. The guilt in his chest felt unbearable, a weight he hadn't known he could carry. How many years had he spent punishing himself for losing Evan? How How many years had Rex spent waiting, guarding this box, holding on to a hope that Walter had given up on long ago? Rex nudged the old man again, this time with more insistence, his golden eyes glimmering with something close to determination. Walter finally looked down at him, and the way Rex's tail wagged, tentative, unsure, but full of longing, brought a fresh wave of tears to his eyes. "I'm so sorry, boy," Walter whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out a trembling hand to stroke Rex's patchy fur, and the dog pressed into his touch with a low whine, his body quivering as if releasing years of pent-up emotion. For the first time in 4 years, Rex allowed himself to be vulnerable, leaning into the man he had waited for so long. Lila stood to the side, her hands clutching her scarf tightly as she watched the scene unfold. She felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. She thought about her mother, how she'd spent 3 years grieving silently, unable to let go of the pain, unable to move forward. And now, watching Walter and Rex reconnect, she felt something shift in her own heart. Maybe holding on to the past wasn't just about the pain. Maybe it was about remembering the love that had come before it, too. Walter finally pulled himself together enough to speak. "Evan," he murmured, his voice heavy with regret. He must have left this box here that night. For me. But I never came." He looked at Lila, his eyes shining with tears. "I stopped looking. I stopped hoping. But Rex, he never gave up. He stayed here, guarding this all these years." He shook his head, his voice faltering. "What kind of man gives up on his family, on his own grandson?" Lila stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't give up," she said. "You just didn't know how to keep going. It happens to everyone. But Rex, he stayed because he believed you'd find him. And you did." Walter's lip trembled, but he nodded, her words giving him some small measure of comfort. He looked back down at Rex, who was now lying beside the open box. His body relaxed for the first time in years. It was as if the dog had finally laid down a burden that had grown too heavy for him to carry. But there was still one question lingering in Walter's mind. "Where's Evan?" he asked hoarsely, turning to Lila. He said he was waiting. But where? The words hung in the cold air, unanswered. Walter had carried this question for over a decade. But now, with the letter in his hand and Rex beside him, the silence felt more unbearable than ever. Lila didn't know what to say. The letter didn't give a clear answer. It simply said Evan had waited, that he didn't want Walter to be angry with Rex. But what had happened to him? Where had he gone? It was Rex who broke the tension. The dog stood suddenly, his body stiff with purpose. He sniffed the air, his ears perking up, and then he began to walk. No lead. He moved through the snow with a strange certainty, glancing back at Walter and Lila as if urging them to follow. "Where's he going?" Lila asked, her breath visible in the cold air. "I don't know," Walter replied, his voice trembling. But he didn't hesitate. He followed Rex, clutching the letter tightly in his hand, his boots crunching through the snow. Lila hurried after them, her heart pounding in her chest. Rex led them out of the park and into the woods at its edge. The snow-laden trees stood tall and silent, their branches hanging low from the weight of ice. The path was narrow and uneven, but Rex never faltered, his movements sure and deliberate. Walter and Lila exchanged nervous glances, but neither of them spoke. It was as though they both understood on some instinctual level that Rex knew something they didn't. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. At the center of it was an old, weathered wooden shack, half buried under snow. It looked abandoned, its windows fogged and cracked, its roof sagging with age. Walter froze in his tracks, his breath hitching. This wasn't here before," he whispered. "At least, not that I remember." Rex barked sharply, his tail wagging as he bounded toward the shack. He pawed at the door, whining insistently, and Walter's legs moved on their own as he followed. His heart was racing, his hands shaking as he reached for the rusted doorknob. He turned it slowly, the creak of the door cutting through the heavy silence. Inside, the air was cold and still, But there was life here. Faint, fragile, but unmistakable. A man sat on an old cot in the corner, his body thin and hunched, his face hidden beneath a ragged hood. He looked up slowly as the door opened, his sunken eyes widening in shock. "Grandpa!" The voice was weak, raspy, but unmistakable. Walter's knees nearly gave out. "Evan," he choked, stumbling forward. The man, no, the boy, now grown, rose shakily to his feet. "I thought..." Evan's voice broke, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "I thought you forgot about me." Walter closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling Evan into a fierce, trembling embrace. "I could never forget you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've looked for you for so long. Evan, I thought I lost you." Evan clung to him, his thin frame shaking with sobs. "I didn't know how to come back," he admitted. "I thought you didn't want me. But Rex stayed. He made me feel like I wasn't alone." Behind them, Rex stood in the doorway, his tail wagging furiously, his eyes bright and alive with joy. For the first time in years, his family was whole again. They spent the night together in the shack, sharing stories, tears, and warmth. Evan explained how he had survived, how he had been too ashamed to return after running away, how he'd built a life of solitude in the woods, with Rex as his only companion. Walter apologized over and over, vowing never to let his grandson feel unwanted again. Lila sat quietly, a smile tugging at her lips as she watched their reunion, feeling her own heart heal in the process. By Christmas morning, they returned to Ash Hollow together, Rex leading the way. The people of the town watched in awe as the old man, the young girl, and the once-forgotten dog walked side by side, their bond unshakable. Rex's vigil was over, but his story had just begun. Christmas morning dawned with a brilliance Ash Hollow hadn't seen in years. The sky was clear, the snow glittering like tiny diamonds under the pale winter sun. But for the first time in 4 years, the old oak tree in Evergreen Park stood alone. The tattered box, the faded wrapping paper, and the ever-faithful dog who had guarded it were gone. Instead, a new story was unfolding, one that would bring hope not just to Ren or Rex, but to everyone who had watched his vigil from afar. Word of the reunion spread quickly. By mid-morning, townsfolk gathered outside the Carter home, where Walter and Evan sat side by side on the porch, drinking steaming mugs of cocoa. Rex lay curled at their feet, his tail wagging lazily, his body finally at rest. Lila stood nearby, her father by her side, her face bright with a quiet pride she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since her mother's passing, she felt like this Christmas held something special, something worth celebrating. Walter couldn't stop staring at Evan. Every time his grandson spoke, the old man's eyes filled with tears, as if he were trying to memorize every word, every detail, to make up for all the years they had lost. "I thought I'd never get the chance to say it," he said, his voice trembling as he placed a hand on Evan's shoulder. "But I'm so proud of you. And I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you needed me most." Evan smiled faintly, his hand resting on Rex's head. "You don't have to say sorry anymore, Grandpa." "Rex," he made sure I never felt completely alone. "And now we have each other again. That's all that matters." Nearby, Lila's father, David, watched the scene with a faraway look in his eyes. He placed a hand on Lila's shoulder, squeezing it gently. "You were right," he said softly, his voice breaking. "Sometimes it's not about fixing what's broken. It's about being there, no matter how long it takes." Lila looked up at him, her heart swelling. "It's never too late," she said simply, echoing what she had come to believe watching Walter, Evan, and Rex reunite. The town moved on from Rex's vigil, but his story became a legend in Ash Hollow, told and retold every Christmas as a reminder of loyalty, love, and the power of hope. For Rex, his days of waiting were over, replaced by the warmth of family and the comfort of belonging. He no longer sat alone in the park, staring into the distance. Instead, he slept soundly by the fire in Walter's home, his once patchy coat growing thick and glossy again, his eyes alive with contentment. For Walter and Evan, the reunion marked a new beginning. They spent their days rebuilding what they had lost, their bond stronger than ever. And for Lila, the experience gave her the courage to start rebuilding her own life, to share her grief with her father and let him share his with her. Together, they found a way to move forward, no longer weighed down by the silence of their shared sorrow. As for the box, Walter kept it on a shelf in his home, its contents a reminder of the love that had survived even the darkest of winters. The faded photographs and Evan's letter became symbols of what mattered most: the enduring connections between hearts